So mercenaries are really important in PD2, especially on hardcore. It's crucial to get your merc up and running right away when you start on hell. There's a few ways to accomplish this. The most important and easiest way is to use a few crafting recipes. First off, you want to do a safety chest for the PDR. In this case, it rolled only 6% with a low enhanced defense roll. You can definitely get way better than this, but you want to use at least an exceptional base, ideally an elite base, even better if it's ethereal. You also want to use the safety recipe for the helm slot for the same purpose. Again, exceptional or elite base ideally. You get another PDR item. Once again, I only landed 6%, but it'll get you off the ground. For the belt slot, you should make a blood craft. I forgot the rune, it's a Tal rune. The blood belt will provide the merc with some much needed lifesteal. And again, for the weapon, you also want to use a blood craft initially. If you're using an Act 5 merc, you can use any sword, hammer, or axe. Again, elite base is mandatory. If you don't find one, you can try and shop one at Larsuk on hell mode with a dual arena portal next to him. Ethereal is good, but it's not as good as it used to be, so the main thing is to get elite and not exceptional base and get a half decent roll on it. In this case I got the 180 ED and I guess 4 lifesteal. I socketed it with an Amrune for additional lifesteal. And this will already be enough to get your merc going, as long as the monsters he's fighting aren't too crazy. From there, you can work on the 2 remaining slots. For gloves, I tend to shop 20 attack speed increased gloves right away. You can get those from any merchant selling gloves, basically. Boots, I'll typically shop some pair of wrist boots, depending on what the mercenary is needing. At this point, your wrists on the mercenary are going to be pretty poor, so don't hesitate to socket these 2 slots right away, especially with the introduction of the Larsuk Malice. There's really no point not spending at least 1, maybe 2 of your Larsuk quests just to socket stuff right away. These can be obtained for 600k gold, so there's really no excuse for not socketing right away. Like for the helm and the chest slot, you can socket runes that provide 30 res, like a Rel, in this case providing 35 res. The other ones are Ord runes for lightning res and Thol for cold res. But I think fire and light are the main resistances you need to cover right away. And with that said, you can start working on upgrades for the other slots depending on what your mercenary needs are. Most of the time on hardcore you're going to be using a melee merc, so there's a few ways to kit them out depending on what your character needs. Early on, day 1, of course the main priority is just get the highest damage weapon basically that will help keep your merc alive by leeching more and help you kill stuff faster. There's quite a few options here. Some of them are obvious, people know about IK Maul and various uniques, but a few other often overlooked ones is something like a Steel Driver. If you upgrade this twice, it'll have like 800 top end damage, and the strength requirement of a Thunder Maul won't be there because it has -50 requirements. Another couple potentially overlooked rune words is Unbending Will. This rune word is really good for Mercenary on day 1. The only caveat is you need a 6-socket sword. In this case I have an Executioner sword because a Colossus Blade is pretty hard to come by. But an Executioner sword you can get in Nightmare Chaos, and you just spend a Larsuk quest and get 6 sockets. Because the rune cost is fairly low, something you can easily get within an hour or 2 of finishing hell. And it provides great damage as well as 10% lifesteal, so it's pretty tough to beat. Another choice you might not have considered is an Honor Axe. In this case I have a Champion Axe, but the easiest base to get is a Decapitator, because again it gets 5 sockets from Larsuk quest. This weapon has decent damage, lifesteal and deadly strike, which is basically everything you need to get going. Now if your build continues to use an Act 5 mercenary, which is very often the case on hardcore because one of them offers battle orders. There's a few choices as well. Most PD2 players are familiar with the 3 weapons that provide a chance to cast amplify damage, which is something you definitely want on something like a summon druid or maybe a barbarian of a melee variety of some kind. Other choices that you might not have considered is these 2. This one offers damage reduction, which is really good if your main task of your mercenary is to just stay alive and tank, which is often the case if you're playing something like a sorceress. Warlord's Trust, similar story. It grants up to 20% PDR as well as some resistances. Another choice is Lawbringer Runeword. It got changed in PD2, so apart from casting Decrepify, it also has very decent damage with the 200 enhanced damage. Again, the easiest base to obtain for this is Legend Sword, because it gets 3 sockets from Logic Quest again. So if you find an Ethereal Legend Sword, that's a decent base for Lawbringer. Other choices for the Act 5 Mercenary are the Aura Runewords. This one provides resistant fire. This one also provides resist fire. This one provides resist lightning, and finally Frostwind provides resist cold. So all these auras boost the elemental damage of this specific element, which is useful in some builds. But I think in many cases you might get more value out of simply wearing the highest damage possible mercenary weapon, because the mercenaries can pack quite the punch with the splash damage on here. For the Act 2 mercenary, people know the typical Aura Runewords Insight and eventually Infinity, of course. People who've been playing PD2 for a while will be familiar with Storm's Miami with the static field debuff proc, which is obviously number 1 choice if you're playing a lightning based build like Phoenix Strike Assassin, Javason, Lightning Sorceress, etc. The big difference between the Act 2 and the Act 5 Mercenary is the Act 2 Mercenary, you can get Defiance Aura, which makes the Mercenary way tankier and much easier to keep alive initially until you have better gear. The Biomerc is kind of what you want to use as a hardcore player because of the 400 life buff, but sometimes you have to just start off with the Act 2 Defiance Mercenary to actually have a merc that stays alive. As for the other slots, there's a lot of choices. The first upgrades you kind of want to do is get a rock stopper, vamp case, some kind of helm like that which grants PDR that's better than a craft. Same for the chest slot. Unless you're playing a summon build where you have other stuff that can tank for you, you kind of want something like a rock fleece, shaft stop Leviathan, just to help the mercenary stay alive. If you're playing a summon build or another build where the merc doesn't need to tank as much damage, you can use a chest that focuses more on increasing his damage output, like a Lionheart, a Black Hades with attack speed jewels, or the new runeword coming up in the new patch called Hustle. Similarly, on the other slots, Laying of Hands is a really good choice for melee mercs to get ASAP, 20% increased attack speed, Varus, huge damage to demons bonus. For the boots, my goal is going to be to get Cannot Be Frozen usually. Rite of Passage is the easy choice, later on you can get Marrow Walk. But to start off, anything with res will usually do. If you're farming Tramical, you might need something like Inferno Stride or Hotspur on the Mercenary to increase his fire resistance to help him survive against the Hydras. The belt slot, I think the number 1 choice for me on pretty much any merc that is in Act 3 is going to be String of Ears at all times. The 15% PDR just helps the merc stay alive, and I don't want to deal with having to revive my mercenary once I'm doing maps. For the helm slot, there's quite a few options depending on what your build needs. Most people are familiar with the new Flickering Flame runeword if you're playing a fire build for the resist fire aura. Not so many people think about Delirium. This runeword provides great crowd control, and I'll definitely use it on a sorcerer's mercenary helm slot. it's pretty hard to beat. I know there are other runeward helms that provide some procs that help you, but I think Delirium offers the most in terms of crowd control and helping keep your character alive. You want to pair this with as much increased attack speed as you can fit onto the mercenary to increase the proc ratio. Some other early option choices is something like a Sagan's combo. Before you get stuff like laying on fancy string of ears. Any piece combined with gloves will provide 30% attack speed and 10% lifesteal, which is very handy on a melee mercenary. Another similar one is IK belt and IK gloves. Grants 30 attack speed, I think, but no lifesteal, so I wouldn't say it's quite as good as Sagan's, depending on your remaining slots. I would always favor laying off hands though. As for the Act 1 mercenary, people know the two proc wound words, unique items. If you're playing a fist damage build like a druid summoner, you tend to want to use Witchwall Strength for the amplify proc, or Pus Spitter if you're playing some kind of elemental build that benefits from the low resistance proc. But just starting out initially on day 1, some builds will typically use a Vigor Rogue, but what you can do is you can make a Harmony rune word in a bow, and then you can switch the mercenary to get another aura. For example, the cold aura with the meditation, which is very useful on some builds like a Trump Assassin. As for the Act 3 mercenary, it's not being used a lot on hardcore, but it has a lot of potential endgame if you want to toss enough runes at it. But I'm just going to go over a quick setup in the few cases you are going to use it, because as many people know, the cold mercenary is extremely strong, and it can basically clear any non-cold immune hell monster on hell for you almost immediately. So the most obvious thing is to get increases cast rate as much as possible. For this, the cheapest options are Spirit Sword, Stealth Chest, Cast a Craft Belt. This will probably get him to 58 breakpoint. 86 is probably a bit of a stretch unless you put something like a Splendor runeword in the shield slot. Helm, typically you'll want something with res. It could be something as simple as a 3-socket helm with Ral or Tool runes. Gloves, similar story, maybe res, maybe shopped 10 cast rate gloves. Boots, probably some kind of res again.